What's that? Feet do get dirty. Do you see about feet? They're on the bottom of you. Boy. I hate getting involved in politics, but I've gotten involved in politics. I don't know that that's a bad thing. You know, it's kind of like you say something, you've discriminated. You don't say something, you've discriminated. Bill C11. Bill C11 is being, opposition is saying that Bill C11 in Canada, which is a new bill that's meant to regulate content, add in the addition of Canadian content to online streaming platforms into Canada. And so, like any other thing political, this is getting kicked around and used as a vantage point from every angle possible. That's politics. One of the things about politics is that one of the things about bills is that someone will put a bill into existence, and with having put that bill into existence, when they are no longer using that bill, the bill still exists. The longer it hangs around, the stronger it gets. Somebody else comes by and either reinterprets it legally, you know, or amends it, right? And then it gets used for something different. You know, at one point, you know, the feather that's used to like wave around as a symbol of peace is now being used to poke out your eye, kind of thing. And that's very much Canadian politics. One of the other big issues in Canada right now too, in my honest opinion, is so many different provinces, and you know, like the current federal government is very much on board with the idea of different provinces in Canada having a fair amount of autonomy. All of these different provinces in Canada are gaining more and more levels of autonomy. Now this is not a political, I'm not representing one party or promoting another party or something. I'm looking at, you know, unobjectively. My issue with that is that, like, yes, whilst, you know, different provinces in Canada are able to manage their own affairs better than, say, the federal government, as opposed to having one mandated law across the entire country, it also creates different little countries. It will create more and more different little countries, right? And someday, you know, this giant country, like many other giant countries, like Russia, for example, will be in jeopardy of falling apart. You know, this is typical to countries, right? I don't know why people don't have the foresight to see this, but this is typical to countries. If a country doesn't have an underlying unification of something, it will fall apart. You know, you need underlying unification for things to grow and exist, and if you don't have it, it won't. Right? You need some level of underlying, you know, unification. One of the things about Bill C11, which is this online streaming act, which is intended to bring more content through streaming media platforms, you know, one of the things this is being used as being accused of being communism. You know, that it's a level of control and manipulation in relation to what people watch and view. Is that a bad thing? communism is a bad thing. I'm not a communist, right? Communism only works on paper. We all know this, all around the world, right? Doesn't matter what country you're in. We all know this. It only works on paper. That's why communist countries move away from communism. But the thing is that like, for example, in the States, there is so much like LGBT hate, right? There is so much racial hate, right? The reason why you have racial riots in the United States is because there is racial hate. You know, that all spills over into my country and from different countries around the world, right? And things like totalitarianism, dictatorships, and fascism is coming back in fashion. This is just how it is, right? Should there not be some sort of like means of controlling media coming into our country? If it's hateful propaganda, should there not be some means of controlling it coming into our country? Because the United States has one opinion about things, we have another opinion about things, yet we share the same streaming platforms. And that influence does things like drastically impacts the lives of people like me. Right? All that hate that's going on with like the DeSantis camp in the US, you know, that all negatively impacts someone like me over here in Canada. You know, all the gender freedoms, you know, in the words of Putin, that are happening in Canada, you know, this is, in my opinion, positively influencing what's happening in places like the United States. I'm sure the tables can be turned and there can be negative things happening here that are influencing the United States and vice versa. But one of the things that people don't get about being somebody like me is that, like, you know, if you're, for example, if you're black, right? And someone says you are this or that, and it's a racist comment, right? That person can turn around and say, you are racist so-and-so, right? And they have a leg to stand on. And people can't just come up onto social media platforms and just say, you know, kick around this word and that word, and black people are this, black people that, or purple people, whatever you want, right? You know, and get away with it. However, you can when they're like me. Anyone with a phone, anyone with access to an internet connection can post whatever they want, almost, about somebody like me. And it has been a free-for-all for as long as I can remember. It's been a free-for-all for as long as I can remember. And a lot of that hate spills in from the US into Canada. What do a lot of Canadians do, which is very typical? I know this because I'm from Nova Scotia. There's a lot of, Nova Scotia is a bit more old world, a bit more UK old world than the rest of the country. And, you know, one of the cultural aspects is that you don't hit a person to their face, you hit the person to their back, because it's impolite. Different parts of Canada, they just hate you to your face. Which is far more North American in my opinion, but I don't know, should there not be some regulation around hateful propaganda? You know, and then conversely, right? You know, I don't understand why we in Canada do not have our own social media platforms, right? If we have our own social media platforms, if we have our equivalent to Netflix or something, mind you, these are global competitors, right? And so these competitors need to like do things like incorporate Canadian content, you know? The thing about it is, you know, for example, back in the 90s and onwards, especially the 90s and the 70s, you know, there was a lot of Canadian content. There was a lot of Canadian and British content, right? They were circulating around the world. And then suddenly, for whatever reason, this hegemony of American content is becoming the norm, right? Now, one reason is the Americans make great content, right? The people over in the USA, a lot of my favorite bands, a lot of my favorite musicians, you know, jazz evolved out of, you know, the United States, rap evolved out of the United States, blues evolved out of the United States. I wouldn't say specifically heavy metal, but heavy metal is maybe a prime example of something that evolved between like British and American cultural fusion. You know, like in the 70s, there was a huge British-American cultural fusion in music. So you have this like, a lot of time English, you know, musical cadences and musical ideas, things, or, you know, European musical ideas, like things like fugues and rounds and whatnot being fused into, or even like jigs and reels being fused into like modern day, you know, synthesizer, distorted guitar, punk rock, metal, whatever, you know, that's kind of like coming out of the classic rock, hard rock, disco, whatever, that's coming out of the US, is getting fused with what's going on in, say, Europe, largely in England, in Britain. Another prime example of something like that, maybe ABBA. You know, it had this waltzing ballroom kind of sound mashed with disco. But that content, that social media content that's being generated, that's being utilized by these different streaming platforms, mostly which are American, if not all, you know, that generates economy, that generates income. Now, should we not be joining in with these different social media platforms to generate economy and income? Of course we should. But then should we not also have our own social media platforms generate our own income? And one of the big issues about this, right, and maybe even just as bigger or as relevant as economy, is it culture, right? We here in Canada have it, believe it or not, we are not American. We are different than the Americans. We have a different culture. We even talk differently sometimes, right? Canada has been through numerous different cultural changes, you know, just like the US or anybody else around the world. But, you know, we are largely swamped out by the big brother of the world in terms of culture. You know, but this affects our culture in various different ways, both negatively and positively. You know, for example, one of the biggest bands that came out of the 90s was Nirvana, right? That grunge sound, you know, that alt rock sound, that was distinctly American. Distinctly American. It was fabulous. It inspired a whole wave, a whole genre of music that spread out all around the world and is still kind of going today, you know? And it was literally just a revamp of different forms of music that became solidified into one new sound, you know, whether you want to call it grunge or alternative or something, right? Fantastic music. You would have never had it, right? But there was also Canadian bands that came out of the 90s that were as equally good, that never made the light of day, right? And if we have our own streaming media platforms, or if we have our content on streaming media platforms, you know, then suddenly we have things like music, you know, we have things like arts, we have things like filmography, you know, literature, audiobooks, on and on and on and on, the list goes on and on and on. That not generates content and economy and culture for these different social media platforms. It generates content, economy, and culture for us as well. Right? And there are a lot of beneficial things about Canadian culture. You know, for example, you will find that a lot of Canadians are fairly intelligent. A lot of Canadians have something to offer. There was so many bands, like in the 90s, like I'm a fan of music, there were so many bands, so many fantastic bands in Canada, you know, that had a blip with a scene and a sound, you know, and kind of dissipated. And same with Britain. There was so many different, you know, great sounds, great music and artists that were coming out of the UK for God knows how long, right? And it just kind of like all got lost in a hegemony of like American media. I think things need to change in that regard, you know, and to be viewing it as communism, I don't know. You know, there is also issues with propaganda. And one of the best ways to deal with things like hate and propaganda is through culture. You have to generate that culture. You have to generate it. You have to create it. You have to generate it. You have to maintain it. You know, for other people to benefit from it. Because even something as simple as like Mickey Mouse is cultural. Mickey Mouse, Disney, the institution of Disney is just as much as cultural as MIT or Harvard. Or McGill in Canada, or Dalhousie in Canada. I don't know, I don't know what everybody is. Politics ruin everything, man. Politics ruin everything. Politics even combat common sense. You know, you can put something in writing. Politics affects our lives so drastically. You look at something like Bill C11, which has never been amended. It drastically affects the lives of minorities like me. Drastically. You know, I'm dealing with PTSD due to Bill C-51.